Understanding medieval concepts of cleanliness. What clean meant in the Middle Ages. In the softly lit world of the Middle Ages, the word clean did not always carry the same meaning it does today. While we associate cleanliness with frequent washing, antiseptics, and sanitation, medieval people often had a different perspective. Cleanliness was not merely physical. It was deeply intertwined with spiritual, social, and even astrological beliefs. To be clean often meant to be morally pure, aligned with religious ideals, and free from sin. People were far more concerned with the state of the soul than the condition of the skin. A clean person, in the eyes of many, was someone who prayed regularly, lived humbly, and avoided moral corruption. Dirt on the body was seen as a natural part of existence, something unavoidable, and sometimes even noble, as long as one's soul remained unsoiled. This doesn't mean that medieval people were oblivious to physical dirt. In fact, they often associated filth with disease, misfortune, or poverty. But their tools and standards were different. Washing hands and faces was common, but full-body bathing was rarer and often seasonal. The idea of sterilizing, scrubbing, and disinfecting was centuries away. Hygiene was also ritualized. A person might wash before a religious service, before a meal, or after traveling. This ritual washing had more to do with symbolic purification than removing germs, which were unknown at the time. Cleanliness was sometimes linked to the stars, as astrological events were believed to affect health and bodily balance. Even clothing played a role. A person could wear clean, freshly laundered clothes and be seen as clean, even if their body hadn't been bathed in weeks. Perfumes and herbs were used to mask odors, and scented waters were sprinkled in rooms or on handkerchiefs. In essence, clean was a concept shaped by religion, status, and practicality. It was a state of being, not just a matter of soap and water. Religious views on purity and the body. Religion permeated every corner of medieval life, and views on cleanliness were no exception. The Christian Church had profound influence over how people thought about their bodies, and especially how they thought about purity. In a world where the soul was eternal and the body was temporary, physical cleanliness took a backseat to spiritual purity. According to many theologians of the time, the body was a vessel of temptation, prone to sin and impurity. Bathing too frequently or taking pleasure in it was sometimes frowned upon, as it was thought to indulge the flesh. Yet, paradoxically, cleanliness was also valued when it related to holy rituals. Monks and nuns would wash before prayers or Holy Communion, not out of concern for hygiene, but to symbolically purify themselves before entering the presence of God. This act of washing hands, feet, or faces was seen as a gesture of spiritual readiness, rather than a cleansing of dirt. In many religious texts and sermons, filth was associated with moral decay, while cleanliness was likened to holiness. Saints were often described as clean in spirit, even if they lived in rags or went unwashed. The emphasis was on inner virtue, not outer appearance. However, religious orders did establish some standards for hygiene. Monasteries often had access to running water, and rules for washing and sanitation were more advanced than in many towns. The rule of Saint Benedict, for example, prescribed washing during specific times, such as before meals or on holy days. Cleanliness was also tied to penance and confession. A person seeking forgiveness might undergo ritual washing or purification rites. Baptism itself was a form of divine cleansing, marking the transition from sin to salvation. Overall, religious views added layers of meaning and restriction to the concept of hygiene. The body was seen as a temporary shell, a challenge to the soul, and its cleanliness mattered only when it served a higher, spiritual purpose. Differences between urban and rural hygiene. The experience of cleanliness varied significantly depending on where one lived. In rural areas, where life was more connected to the rhythms of nature, hygiene was dictated by access to resources and seasonal demands. In towns and cities, the sheer number of people living in close proximity created different challenges and different solutions. In the countryside, access to fresh water was more common. Villages were often built near rivers, streams, or wells, allowing people to wash themselves, their clothes, and their animals with relative ease. Bathing might be done in natural settings, especially in warmer months. Rural folk used herbs, ashes, or even sand as scrubbing agents. These people may not have bathed often by modern standards, but they had practical ways of staying relatively clean within their means. In contrast, urban centers were crowded and chaotic, with narrow streets, poor drainage, and high population density. Waste disposal was a major problem. Many towns lacked effective sewage systems, and waste was often tossed into streets or ditches. Despite this, townspeople did attempt to maintain order. Public bathhouses were more common in cities than in rural areas, providing a place for regular washing, though these often became associated with other social or even immoral activities. Urban dwellers had to contend with water access issues. Drawing water from a well or public fountain could involve waiting in long lines. Water might be rationed or limited to certain times of day. For the wealthy, private wells or indoor facilities made hygiene easier. For the poor, cleanliness was more challenging. Cultural expectations also differed. City life required more social interaction, so appearance and odor mattered more. People used perfumes, washed their hands more regularly, and were more likely to clean their outer garments, even if their bodies remained largely unwashed. Thus, rural and urban hygiene were shaped by environment, economy, and community size. Each setting had its benefits and drawbacks, but neither had perfect hygiene by modern definitions. Myths about medieval dirtiness. The popular imagination often paints the Middle Ages as a time of complete filth, muddy streets, unwashed peasants, and stinking cities. While it's true that sanitation was rudimentary by modern standards, many of these ideas are exaggerated or misunderstood. One common myth is that people never bathed. In reality, bathing was practiced, though the frequency and style varied. Many people bathed a few times a year, especially during festivals or holy days. Public bathhouses were widely used, and wealthier individuals had private bathing facilities. Even peasants bathed in rivers or wooden tubs when possible. Another misconception is that medieval people didn't care about smells or cleanliness. On the contrary, they often used herbs, flowers, and scented waters to keep themselves and their homes pleasant. Lavender, rosemary, and rose water were popular, and clothes were hung in breezy places to air out. The idea that everyone had lice and fleas all the time is also overstated. While these pests were common, people took steps to reduce them. Combs, nitpicking, and even special shampoos made of vinegar or herbs were employed to fight infestations. It's also wrong to assume that toilets didn't exist. While modern plumbing wasn't around, castles had garderobes, towns had privies, and chamber pots were used throughout society. Waste disposal was imperfect, but it wasn't completely absent. Finally, some believed that the church forbade bathing. While there were debates about the morality of bathing, especially mixed-gender public baths, there was no blanket prohibition. In fact, many monastic orders encouraged regular washing. These myths likely stem from the Victorian era, when people projected their own sanitary values onto the past. The truth is more nuanced. Medieval people valued cleanliness, but they worked within the limits of their time. Monastic cleanliness practices. Monasteries were some of the cleanest places in the medieval world, not just spiritually, but physically. Guided by detailed rules and religious discipline, monks and nuns maintained routines that included regular washing, clean clothing, and relatively sophisticated sanitation systems. Most monastic communities followed the rule of Saint Benedict, a guidebook for spiritual and communal life. This rule included instructions on when to bathe, wash hands, and maintain personal hygiene. While full-body bathing wasn't frequent, hands and feet were often washed daily, especially before prayers and meals. Monasteries were designed with practical hygiene in mind. Many had lavatoriums, or washing areas, near the dining halls. Monks would line up and rinse their hands in flowing water channeled from nearby springs or cisterns. Soap, often made on-site from animal fat and ash, was used to clean skin and clothing. Toilets, called reredotes, were built as part of the dormitory structure, often over running water. Waste would be flushed away using gravity or diverted through underground channels. This system, while primitive, was more advanced than most urban homes. Clothing was laundered regularly, especially undergarments. Bedding was also aired out or washed when possible. Monks shaved their heads and beards, not only for humility but also to reduce lice and fleas. Cleanliness was tied to spiritual discipline. Being clean was a form of devotion, a way to honor God through order and self-care. Silence was often observed during washing, turning a mundane task into a sacred ritual. Even gardens and kitchens were maintained with order and sanitation in mind. Waste was composted or buried, water was stored carefully, and food preparation areas were kept clean. Monastic life, with its routines, resources, and sense of purpose, offered a rare glimpse into a structured medieval hygiene system, one that rivaled and often surpassed the cleanliness of many towns. Bathing as a moral or sinful act. Bathing, in the medieval world, was more than a matter of hygiene. It was an act entangled with morality, health, and even temptation. While the idea of immersing oneself in water may seem universally wholesome today, during the Middle Ages, bathing carried a dual identity. It could be seen as both a beneficial ritual and a dangerous indulgence, depending on time, place, and purpose. In early medieval Europe, particularly before the rise of stricter Christian attitudes toward the body, communal bathhouses were quite common. People bathed not just to clean themselves but to socialize, relax, and even conduct business. Men and women might bathe together, especially in places like Germany, France, or the Low Countries. Steam baths, hot baths, and herbal infusions were part of this culture. But as time went on, especially from the 12th century onward, the church's influence over public morals grew stronger, and bathhouses came under suspicion. Not because of dirt, but because of immorality. These shared spaces became associated with sexual promiscuity and even prostitution. Some bathhouses doubled as brothels, and clergy began warning against the dangers of immodesty and temptation that lurked behind steamy walls. Still, bathing wasn't banned. Instead, it became more regulated and private. The wealthy began building personal bath facilities within their homes. These might include wooden tubs lined with linen and scented with flowers or herbs. Servants would fill the tubs with hot water, and elaborate bathing rituals were followed, including massage, hair washing, and application of oils. Doctors of the time had their say too. Many believed that hot water opened the pores, making the body vulnerable to bad airs or illnesses. Therefore, bathing was often advised only under specific circumstances, during the spring or early summer, and never too frequently. Medieval texts also speak of bathhouses with awe and suspicion. Some viewed them as places of physical and moral decline, while others praised them as venues of rejuvenation. This duality reflected broader tensions in medieval thought, the desire to care for the body while not succumbing to vanity or pleasure. So, to bathe was not a neutral act. It was morally coded, socially nuanced, and influenced by everything from religious doctrine to medical theory. Bathing could elevate the body, or, in the wrong context, be its downfall. Medieval medical theories on dirt. To understand medieval cleanliness, one must explore how medicine viewed dirt and disease. Unlike modern germ theory, medieval medical thought was based on the balance of four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health was seen as a harmony among these fluids, and illness was an imbalance. Dirt, then, was not the root cause of disease. It was a symptom, or sometimes an aggravator. Medieval physicians believed that the body was porous, constantly interacting with the environment. Breathing foul air, for instance, could corrupt the blood or disturb the humors. Therefore, they were highly concerned with miasmas, bad smells or corrupted airs that could bring illness. This belief shaped hygiene practices. People tried to avoid swamps, decaying matter, or crowded spaces not because they understood bacteria, but because they feared invisible poisons in the air. Dirt was also thought to block the body's natural functions. A dirty body could trap bad humors inside, preventing their natural release through sweat or other excretions. But paradoxically, overwashing was also discouraged, since it could open the pores too wide and let bad air in. The goal was moderation, as in all things medieval. Medical guides advised washing the hands and face daily, and bathing the body occasionally, more often in summer, when one sweated, and less in winter, when pores were thought to be closed. Herbs like mint, lavender, sage, and rosemary were used to scent water and ward off disease. Physicians even designed bathing regimens. A sick person might be prescribed a warm bath infused with healing herbs, followed by rest and specific foods. Some believed that soaking in mineral springs could restore the balance of the humors. Public baths were occasionally set up near these springs for healing purposes. Interestingly, doctors didn't just focus on external cleanliness. Mental purity and diet were considered part of hygiene too. A clean spirit, clean thoughts, and a well-balanced diet were all seen as essential to health. In summary, while medieval medical theory lacked a modern understanding of microbes, it still placed a high value on cleanliness, as a way to balance the body, avoid environmental dangers, and maintain harmony with nature's rhythms. Social class and cleanliness standards. The rules of cleanliness in the Middle Ages were not the same for everyone. Social class played a decisive role in how hygiene was practiced, perceived, and even judged. The wealthy and noble had different standards and opportunities compared to peasants or laborers, not just in appearance, but in access to water, tools, and privacy. For the upper classes, cleanliness was not only about health or comfort, it was about status and refinement. Lords and ladies had access to private bathing facilities, perfumes, scented soaps, and servants who managed these tasks. Clean linen was a marker of wealth, and frequent changes of clothing were seen as a sign of sophistication. Fabrics were often perfumed or infused with herbs to mask odors. Nobles bathed in large wooden tubs with hot water carried in buckets, sometimes with aromatic oils or petals floating on the surface. Towels were warmed by the fire, and the bathing process was long and ceremonial. Being clean was not just about removing dirt, it was a ritual of elegance. The clergy and monks, particularly in established monasteries, had their own routines rooted in religious obligation and access to facilities. While simpler than noble customs, their hygiene practices were regular and disciplined. For the working classes, things were more practical. Access to clean water depended on proximity to a river, well, or spring. Bathing might occur only a few times a year, often during warmer months or religious festivals. Washing hands and faces was more common and often done daily, especially before meals. Clothing was more limited in number and often worn for long periods before washing. Still, even among peasants, there was a sense of pride in cleanliness. Villagers washed their hands before eating, swept their homes, and maintained tidy appearances when attending church or markets. It's important to note that being dirty was often not a choice, but a result of circumstances. Poverty meant fewer resources, and survival often took precedence over hygiene. Yet even the poor tried to maintain a sense of dignity and order, using what little they had to stay clean within their means. Thus, cleanliness in the medieval world was a layered, class-based experience, with standards, expectations, and possibilities differing greatly across society. Seasonal approaches to hygiene. Medieval life moved to the rhythm of the seasons, and hygiene practices followed suit. People adjusted how, when, and even why they cleaned themselves based on the time of year. Seasonal shifts in temperature, daylight, and water availability shaped the realities of cleanliness in profound ways. Spring and summer were the most favorable times for bathing and cleaning. Rivers and lakes were more accessible, and the warmth made full-body washing more comfortable. Many communities scheduled communal bathing days during spring festivals, not only as a practical necessity but as part of cultural celebration. Washing clothes, linens, and homes was often done in these months, when the sun could dry fabrics and warm water made labor easier. Autumn, being harvest season, left little time for extensive hygiene rituals. People were busy gathering crops, storing food, and preparing for the harsh winter. Bathing and cleaning took a backseat to survival. However, the cool air made sweat less of an issue, and people simply bundled up in layers of wool, often going weeks without a thorough wash. Winter, with its freezing temperatures, was the least hygienic season. Bathing was rare, since heating large quantities of water was difficult and dangerous. Washing in cold water was not only unpleasant but believed to invite illness by shocking the body or opening pores to disease. Instead, people relied on dry hygiene, brushing off dirt, changing outer garments, or using cloths and herbs to freshen themselves. Indoor heating from fireplaces helped to dry wet clothes and warm small washing basins. But full-body bathing was reserved for emergencies or rituals. Herbal sachets were hung in rooms to improve the air, and animals were often kept indoors for warmth, which complicated cleanliness even further. In religious life, liturgical calendars aligned with seasonal cleaning. For example, Lent and Easter prompted spiritual and sometimes physical cleansing. The idea of spring cleaning has roots in these periods of renewal. Ultimately, medieval hygiene wasn't static. It was a living system that responded to nature's cycles, balancing comfort, health, and practicality in a world ruled by the turning of the sun. Cleanliness in medieval literature and art. Medieval literature and art provide rich insight into how people of the time thought about cleanliness, both of the body and the soul. These cultural expressions reveal a society that, while lacking modern scientific knowledge, was deeply concerned with the idea of purity, order, and beauty. In literature, cleanliness often symbolized virtue. Knights in chivalric romances were described as wearing shining armor and possessing bright, noble faces. Cleanliness of dress and manner reflected inner honor and discipline. The lady of the castle, with her ivory skin and sweet scent, symbolized purity, grace, and sometimes divine inspiration. In contrast, villains or sinners were often portrayed as dirty, disheveled, or foul-smelling. This wasn't just about appearance. It was a shorthand for moral corruption. Physical filth in stories served as a metaphor for spiritual decay. The leper, the beggar, or the unwashed traveler might embody the struggles of sin, suffering, or penance. Art from the period shows similar patterns. Illuminated manuscripts often depicted saints and angels as spotless and radiant, while sinners, demons, or corrupt rulers were shown in shadow, dirt, or grotesque forms. Bathing scenes were included in some devotional texts, usually with moral or symbolic intent. For example, King David washing after his sin with Bathsheba was a common motif, symbolizing cleansing through repentance. Tapestries and murals in castles sometimes depicted bath scenes, especially among the nobility, as moments of refinement and elegance. These images were less about hygiene and more about portraying a cultured, leisurely life. Pilgrimage texts and travel diaries mention washing as part of religious preparation. Poets described scents, silks, and clean linens as emblems of both spiritual and social standing. Even humorous tales, like those in Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, include jests about personal odors, dirty habits, or the difference between town and country hygiene. In sum, medieval literature and art were mirrors to the values of the time. Cleanliness wasn't just a matter of soap and water. It was a language of meaning, used to tell stories of sin and salvation, love and nobility, temptation and transformation. Bathing culture and public baths. Origins of public bathhouses in Europe. Long before the rustle of modern plumbing echoed through homes, there existed a deeply ingrained tradition of communal bathing in Europe. In the shadow of ancient Roman influence, public bathhouses, known as thermae, became central to urban life. These sprawling complexes weren't just places to wash away the dust of the day. They were marvels of engineering and testaments to the value placed on cleanliness, social gathering, and leisure. The Romans were not the first to bathe communally, but they perfected the art. Using an intricate system of aqueducts and furnaces, they constructed hot, warm, and cold bathing chambers. As the Roman Empire expanded, so did its bathing culture, stretching into what is now modern France, Germany, and Britain. Even after the fall of Rome, echoes of the thermae lingered. In medieval monasteries, bathhouses survived as part of religious purification practices. With time, these evolved into public spaces once more, serving peasants and nobles alike. The earliest medieval bathhouses were humble wooden structures near rivers or springs, eventually giving way to stone edifices heated by fires. In their flickering candlelight and rising steam, we find the birth of Europe's unique bathing tradition. Communal bathing rituals. Stepping into a medieval bathhouse was a sensory experience, a dance of water, warmth, and whispers. Visitors often arrived at twilight, ready to shed not only their garments but the weight of their daily toil. Rituals governed their time within. First came the cleansing. A simple bucket of water poured over the head or a dip in a cold pool prepared the skin. Then, bathers moved to the warm waters, often infused with herbs like rosemary or lavender. The heat loosened muscles, and conversations began to flow. Scrubbing was communal. Friends, spouses, or even strangers helped one another lather with soap, usually a mixture of lye and animal fat, and scrub with rough cloths or reeds. Afterward, people would sit, chat, sing, and even dine in the warmth of the bath. Roasted meats, sweetmeats, and ale were often enjoyed mid-soak. Massages, foot rubs, and even light grooming followed. Women might braid each other's hair. Men might shave one another. These rituals weren't merely about hygiene. They were moments of intimacy, connection, and reprieve from a harsh world. Gender separation and mixed bathing. Bathing customs weren't uniform across Europe. In some regions, men and women bathed together without shame, while in others, strict separation was enforced. In early medieval times, mixed bathing was common and accepted. Families bathed together, and bathhouses welcomed all. But as moral and religious scrutiny intensified, especially during the later Middle Ages, concerns about propriety led to increasing segregation. Church leaders feared temptation might bubble up in the steamy waters. Mixed bathing became controversial, and regulations appeared. Some towns designated specific days for men and others for women. Others built partitions or entirely separate facilities. Still, not everyone heeded the rules. In cities like Prague or Vienna, mixed bathing persisted well into the 16th century. Sometimes, couples even rented private rooms within larger bathhouses. Thus, bathing customs reflected not only regional preferences but also the push and pull between pleasure and piety, between social freedom and ecclesiastical authority. The decline of public baths. Despite their popularity, public bathhouses eventually fell out of favor. Several currents converged to wash away centuries of communal soaking. Foremost among these was disease. As plague swept through Europe, the Black Death chief among them, people grew wary of shared spaces. Bathhouses, with their warm waters and constant turnover of patrons, were suspected breeding grounds for illness. The rise of Protestantism also brought stricter moral codes. Bathhouses, once places of joy and healing, were now eyed with suspicion. Rumors of lewd behavior and moral decay tainted their reputation. Meanwhile, shifting ideas about hygiene emerged. Many began to believe that water opened the pores and invited disease rather than prevented it. Dry cleaning the body with cloths and perfumes became fashionable. By the 17th century, many bathhouses had closed or converted to other uses. The grand halls fell silent, their tubs dry, and steam rooms abandoned. What had once been a cornerstone of daily life faded into history, though never completely forgotten. Bathhouses and their architecture. Bathhouses weren't merely practical. They were architectural expressions of comfort and care. Whether grand or modest, their designs reflected a society's approach to cleanliness, wellness, and beauty. Roman bathhouses were sprawling complexes with domed ceilings, heated floors, and mosaic-clad pools. Their legacy influenced medieval and Renaissance bathhouses, especially in southern Europe. In northern regions, bathhouses were typically constructed from timber, often near rivers or natural springs. Inside, wooden tubs or stone basins were arranged around a central fire pit or furnace, which warmed the room and heated the water. The more elaborate structures boasted multiple chambers, changing rooms, hot and cold pools, steam rooms, and lounges. High windows filtered soft light into the steamy interiors. Lanterns or candles added a golden glow. In some towns, bathhouses were adorned with decorative tiles, carved beams, or painted frescoes. They were places of pride, carefully maintained and architecturally cherished. The very structure of a bathhouse invited tranquility. Walls thick enough to muffle sound. Floors warm to bare feet. The gentle gurgle of water echoing against stone. Popular bathing herbs and oils. For medieval bathers, the experience wasn't complete without the aromatic touch of herbs and oils. These were not only pleasing to the senses but believed to hold medicinal powers. Lavender was prized for its calming effect. It was scattered into bathwater or bundled into satchels hung by the tub. Rosemary and thyme, antiseptic in nature, were used to cleanse the skin and refresh the spirit. Sage and chamomile added a soothing aroma, often used for muscle aches or skin irritation. Mint, fresh and tingly, awakened the senses, ideal for a morning bath. Bath oils, made from pressed olives or animal fats, were infused with these herbs and massaged into the skin. Sometimes, rosewater or citrus peels were added for a sweet scent. In colder months, spices like clove or cinnamon warmed the body and stirred the blood. Not only did these ingredients enhance relaxation, they also masked unpleasant odors in the era before modern plumbing. The bath became a kind of herbal sanctuary, blending warmth, scent, and healing into one watery embrace. The role of bath attendants. Behind the comfort of every medieval bathhouse stood the hands of quiet caretakers, bath attendants who kept the waters warm, the rooms clean, and the guests content. These attendants, often men in male-only spaces and women in female ones, worked from dawn till dusk. They fetched water, stoked fires, scrubbed tubs, and laundered towels. Their job was both physical and delicate. For wealthier patrons, personal bath attendants were akin to modern-day spa therapists. They offered massages with oils, helped with hair washing, even prepared meals to be enjoyed mid-bath. Attendants had to be discreet, courteous, and skilled. They managed the temperature of the rooms, the placement of guests, and the rhythm of bathing schedules. Some even served as informal confidants, listening quietly as bathers unburdened their hearts. In larger bathhouses, entire teams of attendants worked together, ensuring seamless service. Though rarely celebrated in history books, their presence made the whole experience possible. Public bathhouses as social hubs. A visit to the bathhouse was as much about conversation as cleanliness. These steamy spaces served as the social salons of their time, where gossip flowed as freely as water. Merchants struck deals in the warmth of the pools. Friends shared stories, and neighbors caught up on news. Musicians sometimes played lute or harp while others lounged in the hot mist. For the lower classes, bathhouses offered a rare chance to unwind. For the upper classes, they were places to display wealth and taste, through jewelry, perfumes, or well-crafted robes. Lovers met, families gathered, and strangers mingled. Some bathhouses even hosted poetry readings or religious discussions. In many towns, the bathhouse was the heart of the community, a place where daily stress was washed away in the company of others. Diseases and the bathing controversy. As the centuries turned, concern over disease began to taint the once-beloved bathhouses. Physicians debated the health risks of bathing. Could warm water spread infection? Did open pores invite illness? The Black Death of the 14th century intensified these fears. Public spaces became suspect, and bathhouses, with their communal waters, fell under scrutiny. Though no direct link was proven, fear spread faster than understanding. By the 16th century, medical theory had shifted. The miasma theory, the idea that bad air caused disease, led many to believe that warm, steamy rooms were dangerous. Religious leaders also decried bathhouses as morally suspect. Whispers of sin and scandal began to swirl. In some cities, authorities closed bathhouses entirely or allowed only partial use. Though some physicians argued that bathing, if done properly, strengthened health, the controversy lingered. And slowly, the bathhouse went from cherished tradition to suspicious relic. Private bathing among the wealthy. Even as public bathhouses declined, the wealthy found new ways to enjoy the luxury of bathing, this time in private. Castles and manor houses added bathing chambers, complete with large wooden tubs, fireplace-warmed water, and perfumed soaps. Servants carried buckets up flights of stairs to fill these tubs, sometimes taking hours to prepare a single bath. Royalty and nobility spared no expense. Silver-handled brushes, rose-scented oils, and imported Turkish towels became symbols of status. Tapestries lined the walls, and musicians might play nearby to enhance the ambience. For noblewomen, bathing became a ritual of beauty. For noblemen, it was one of power and indulgence. Over time, the bath shifted from a communal experience to a solitary one, especially among those who could afford such privacy. What had once been shared with neighbors was now reserved for personal comfort. And yet, even behind stone walls and velvet curtains, the essence of the medieval bathhouse remained: warm water, fragrant herbs, and the timeless desire to wash the world away. What is a garderobe? In the world of medieval sanitation, the garderobe holds a rather central and curious place. To our modern ears, the word might sound fancy, something like a wardrobe or an armoire, but in reality, the garderobe was much closer to what we'd today call a toilet. Specifically, it was a stone or wooden protrusion on the outside wall of a castle, monastery, or grand hall, designed for one purpose: the disposal of human waste. To imagine a garderobe, picture a small, narrow room, often cold and dim, tucked into a quiet corner of the castle. There would be a wooden seat, sometimes with a lid, and a hole that opened to the outside. Waste dropped down into a chute or, more commonly, directly into a moat or pit below. Some garderobes even emptied into flowing water if the castle was lucky enough to sit near a stream. And that was the end of it. Interestingly, the name garderobe literally means to guard robes, based on the belief that the ammonia in the air would repel lice and insects from clothing hung in the same space. And so, in a strange twist of hygiene, noble garments were sometimes stored in these very toilets. The smell? Undoubtedly potent. The experience? Likely chilling. But for the time, the garderobe was a mark of architectural advancement and even luxury. It showed that the residents could afford privacy, indoor sanitation, and design considerations for waste management, however rudimentary. Castle toilet systems. Castles were immense stone fortresses, designed for defense, status, and control. Within their thick walls lay all the essential aspects of daily life, including the necessity of a toilet. And so, castle toilet systems were developed, varied in their designs, yet all centered around one critical need: removing waste with as little hassle as possible. Most castles had built-in garderobes, one or more for the lord's chambers, others for guests, soldiers, and servants. These were strategically located near the exterior walls so gravity could take the waste outside, away from the interior spaces. Often, chutes made of stone funneled the waste downwards into cesspits or directly into the moat. Over time, these chutes could become clogged, and it was someone's unpleasant job to clean them. Some castles had multiple garderobes stacked vertically, forming what we might call a toilet tower. This allowed waste to flow downward through several floors, streamlining the system. In rare cases, these towers were designed with running water from nearby streams to help flush the waste away. The design was ingenious for its time. While it lacked modern sanitation and sewage systems, it served its purpose well in the often cramped quarters of medieval strongholds. Castle toilets were never warm, never perfumed, and rarely pleasant, but they were essential. Even the most powerful lords had to go somewhere. Moats and waste disposal. Moats, those wide ditches filled with water that surrounded medieval castles, were defensive features, but they also served another, less glorious purpose: waste disposal. In many castles, the garderobes or latrine chutes emptied directly into the moat. This meant that not only did the water discourage invaders, but it also carried away human waste. Unfortunately, this setup came with consequences. Stagnant water combined with waste created a brew of foul odors and disease-causing bacteria. Mosquitoes bred freely, and the air near the moat was often rank and heavy with unpleasant scents. Nonetheless, the system worked in its own way. The constant flow of water, if there was a stream nearby, could help move waste away from the castle, keeping the area slightly cleaner. In dry seasons or poorly constructed moats, however, waste could build up, attracting vermin and posing health risks. Despite these issues, disposing of waste into a moat was considered a practical solution. After all, medieval people did not have the luxury of underground sewage systems or water treatment facilities. They used what was available, even if that meant living beside a slowly churning stew of filth. Moats, though iconic for their military significance, were also silent witnesses to the less glamorous realities of castle life. Urban privies and sanitation. Beyond castles and into the crowded medieval towns, the challenges of sanitation became even more pronounced. Streets were narrow, homes were close together, and there was no centralized waste system. In this urban maze, the humble privy became the most common toilet facility. Urban privies were usually simple wooden or stone structures built in backyards or alleyways. They often sat above cesspits, holes dug into the ground to collect human waste. These pits were periodically emptied by gong farmers, workers who cleaned and carted away the contents, often at night. In wealthier homes, the privy might be indoors or semi-covered, with a seat and perhaps even a small water channel for cleaning. For the poor, however, the options were far more basic, and many people resorted to chamber pots emptied into the street or nearby river. The streets themselves were not spared. Waste was sometimes tossed from windows into the roads below, leading to the infamous cry, "Guard loo," a warning to passers-by that something unpleasant was about to rain down. Sanitation was rudimentary at best, and outbreaks of disease, cholera, dysentery, and plague were common. Still, people adapted. They built systems, hired workers, and developed local rules for cleanliness. And amid the stink and chaos of medieval towns, the urban privy was a small but vital attempt at managing human needs. Chamber pots in homes and inns. Chamber pots were a ubiquitous part of medieval life. Simple, portable, and highly functional, these pots served as in-home toilets for the vast majority of people who did not have access to garderobes or privies. Made of ceramic, pewter, or even wood, chamber pots were kept under beds, behind curtains, or in the corner of rooms. They were used by nobles and peasants alike. In castles and manor houses, servants were often tasked with emptying and cleaning the pots. In inns and taverns, guests were expected to use shared chamber pots, which would be periodically emptied by staff. The process was simple. One used the pot, covered it if necessary, and then emptied it, either into a cesspit, a garden, as fertilizer, or, quite commonly, directly into the street. While the chamber pot was practical, it contributed significantly to the poor sanitation of urban areas. Still, it offered something deeply valued: convenience. Especially at night, when walking outside to the privy was cold, dangerous, or simply too far, the chamber pot was a welcome solution. Its quiet presence under beds or beside fireplaces tells a story of daily life that is both humble and human. Cleanest places in the medieval world. The monks who lived in these religious communities' routine, order, and cleanliness, not just of the soul, but of the body and the living environment as well. This included careful systems for managing waste. Monasteries often featured rows of latrines known as reredotes, attached to dormitories so monks could relieve themselves during the night without leaving the building. These latrines were built over running water whenever possible, allowing waste to be carried away. Some monasteries engineered elaborate drainage systems using aqueducts and streams to ensure that waste did not stagnate or contaminate their food or water supplies. The monks even created guidelines for when and how to clean the latrines, who would do the work, and how to dispose of the contents. Composting and the use of human waste as fertilizer were also practiced. In the monastery garden, everything had a purpose, even waste. Monastic sanitation was ahead of its time, driven by both spiritual and practical needs. Cleanliness was next to godliness, and their systems reflected that belief. Toilets in medieval hospitals. Medieval hospitals were not just centers for healing, but also for religious care and shelter. Sanitation played a key role in both the physical and spiritual recovery of patients. Although far from modern medical standards, hospitals of the time made attempts at cleanliness, especially when it came to waste. Toilets, or privies, were usually placed in separate wings of the hospital, sometimes connected to running water. Cesspits were cleaned regularly, and staff were trained in basic hygiene practices. For patients too ill to move, chamber pots were provided and emptied by nurses or attendants. The design of hospital privies aimed to prevent the spread of disease. Some were even ventilated or separated by partitions to offer a semblance of privacy and reduce odor. In certain monasteries that ran hospitals, the emphasis on purity led to stricter waste management protocols, including regular hand washing, clean robes, and the burning of contaminated materials. Though limited by their era, medieval hospitals tried to balance care with cleanliness, and their toilet facilities were an important part of that delicate equation. Women's toilet facilities. Women in the medieval world faced unique challenges when it came to using the toilet. Privacy was harder to come by, and societal expectations around modesty made public or communal toileting difficult. In households, women used chamber pots just as men did, but they often had to rely on servants or family members to empty them. In public spaces or during travel, women might use screened privies or corners of gardens. Noble women occasionally had designated ladies-in-waiting to assist them. In nunneries, sanitation was handled much like in monasteries, with shared latrines and efforts to maintain cleanliness. In towns, public toilet facilities for women were rare, so many made use of private backyards or secluded spots when nature called. Clothing also played a role. The long skirts and heavy layers could be both a burden and a shield, offering some privacy while also complicating the process. Women's toilet history is a quiet one, often undocumented, but it reveals how gender shaped even the most basic aspects of daily life. Toilets on ships and caravans. Traveling in the medieval world was slow and uncomfortable, and going to the toilet was no exception. On ships, space was tight and privacy nearly non-existent. Most vessels had simple wooden seats with holes that hung over the side, known as headboards, from which we get the nautical term the head. Passengers and crew used these facilities regardless of weather or sea conditions. Splashing water, cold wind, and the sway of the ship made the experience far from pleasant. Caravans and overland journeys were no better. Travelers stopped along the roadside or used portable chamber pots. Nobles might travel with tented privies, but most people simply went behind a bush. Hygiene was a secondary concern. The primary goal was relief, and the options were few. Yet even in the discomfort, people adapted. They designed mobile solutions, created makeshift privies, and continued their journeys, because even on the road, nature could not be ignored. The smell and stigma of privies. Lastly, we come to something less technical and more social, the smell and stigma of privies. In a world without plumbing, fragrance was a constant companion. The odor of waste was in homes, streets, and even the corners of castles. To be near a privy was to breathe in its reality. People burned herbs, wore scented pouches, or chewed spices to mask the smell. Privies were built downwind, if possible, or separated from main buildings. The wealthy had servants to clean and perfume the facilities. Yet no matter the precautions, the smell remained. With it came stigma. Speaking of toilets was often considered vulgar. The work of cleaning them was assigned to the lowest classes. And so, while everyone used them, few acknowledged their necessity. Still, privies were essential. They served kings and commoners, monks and merchants. And though they stank, they stood as reminders of our shared humanity, where even in the loftiest towers, someone still had to go. Sources of water in medieval towns. In the soft hush of a medieval town, the search for water was a daily ritual rooted in habit and necessity. Unlike the modern age, where a twist of a tap delivers clean water instantly, medieval people relied on natural and communal sources. Wells were the heartbeat of villages, often dug deep into the earth, sometimes lined with stones, their cold, dark interiors holding the most precious liquid of all, fresh water. In addition to wells, streams, rivers, and even lakes served the needs of the townsfolk. These waters were used for drinking, cooking, bathing, and laundering. Yet, the public fountains and troughs. Fountains in medieval towns were not the grand, sculpted marvels of later centuries. Rather, they were humble structures, practical and communal. Often built at the center of town squares, they served as public watering stations. Some were fed by aqueducts or springs, their water flowing gently into basins carved from stone. Troughs for animals were placed nearby. Horses, donkeys, and oxen drank side by side, their heads dipping rhythmically as townspeople filled their pitchers beside them. There was something timeless in the sound of trickling water, hoofs scraping cobblestones, and murmured conversations echoing off stone walls. These fountains were a source of pride. When one dried up or became fouled, it was a town crisis. Repairs were urgent, and water brought in by cart from elsewhere. Children splashed in their basins, women scrubbed linens at the edges, and beggars rested on the steps, soothed by the scent of wet stone and the endless lull of moving water. At night, Lanterns flickered nearby, casting golden halos over the quiet, still pools. Waterborne diseases and ignorance. The silent dangers of unclean water were not understood in scientific terms, but their effects were all too familiar. People fell ill, sometimes whole neighborhoods. Diarrhea, fever, and vomiting were whispered signs of bad humors or the result of sin. In truth, it was often cholera, dysentery, or typhoid, diseases carried invisibly in the very water they trusted. Rivers downstream of cities became poisoned, yet people still washed and drank from them. Wells too close to cesspits turned deadly in summer. But the understanding of cause and effect was murky. Blame often fell on miasmas, bad smells, or on foreigners, witches, or fate. Doctors recommended wine, ale, or vinegar-infused water as safer alternatives. These had some truth to them, especially since alcohol killed some bacteria. The poor, of course, had fewer choices. Still, life went on. Children played near streams. Old women drew from wells with their bent backs and shawled heads. And when illness came, people prayed, trusting in remedies of garlic, prayers, or a clean breeze through the window. Rainwater harvesting techniques. The gentle plip-plop of rain on thatched roofs was more than a calming sound. It was opportunity. Rainwater, when gathered carefully, offered a pure source untouched by the filth of cities or the contamination of rivers. Catching it was both common sense and quiet ingenuity. Homes had sloped roofs, and gutters, wooden or lead, directed the runoff into barrels or stone cisterns. These containers, often placed at the corners of buildings or beneath eaves, collected enough to serve for bathing, laundry, or watering herbs. Some even used rainwater for drinking, especially if other sources were unreliable. In monasteries, rain was carefully channeled through stone grooves, sometimes filtered through sand or cloth. This system, simple yet effective, kept the cloisters supplied in dry months. In cities, rain barrels were guarded like treasure. A clean barrel of rainwater was softer than well water, sweeter than stream water, and free from the worries of the world. And on quiet evenings, the rhythmic tapping of droplets was as soothing as any lullaby. Water as a social gathering point. To fetch water was a necessity, but it was also a ritual, a rhythm of daily life that brought people together. Around the well or fountain, the town's life unfolded in small vignettes. A young woman chatting with her friend as they filled their buckets, an old man telling stories to a child perched on the stone rim, a mother calming a crying baby while waiting her turn. The act of gathering water was slow. It took time, and in that time, people talked, shared news, bartered for bread, or arranged meetings. Sometimes disputes broke out. Who came first? Who spilled whose water? Other times, flirtations began with a smile, a shared handle, a clumsy splash. In rural areas, the spring or brook served a similar purpose. People sat on grassy banks, dipping their jugs while chickens pecked nearby and the village kept slinked underfoot. Water wasn't just for the body. It was nourishment for the spirit, the heart, the bonds between people. Aqueducts and medieval plumbing. Though the image of aqueducts belongs mostly to Rome, their legacy lingered into medieval times, especially in southern Europe. Some towns maintained old Roman systems, arches carrying water over valleys, stone pipes channeling it into baths and fountains. These were marvels of engineering, and in places like Spain or parts of Italy, they were still functional. In other parts of Europe, simpler plumbing existed. Lead or clay pipes ran beneath cities, directing water from springs to public places. Wealthy homes might have indoor taps, a luxury beyond most imaginations. Drainage was just as important. Gutter channels, carved into streets, directed overflow into nearby rivers. Monasteries had elaborate systems of underground conduits. Some castles had gravity-fed water supplies from nearby hills, an early form of pressure-based plumbing. It wasn't widespread, but where it existed, it felt like magic. Water flowing where it was needed, quietly, smoothly, like a servant that never tired. Dry versus wet toileting cultures. Across regions, toilet practices varied. In wetter climates or wealthier cities, people leaned toward wet systems, privies flushed by rainwater, garderobes perched over moats, or waste chutes connected to small water channels. But in dry lands, the approach was different. Pits, sand, and ash played their role. Waste was covered with straw or soil, and moved by hand to compost heaps or fields. The use of water in sanitation was both a blessing and a risk. It helped move waste away from homes but could carry disease if not properly managed. Thus, in some places, dry methods were preferred, not from lack of understanding, but from environmental wisdom. In either case, privacy was minimal. The communal nature of toileting was accepted. What mattered most was regularity, modesty, and managing the smells. Municipal water laws and regulations. As towns grew, so too did the need for rules. Medieval leaders understood that water was a shared resource, easily misused, easily spoiled. So they wrote laws. Regulations forbade dumping waste near wells or washing hides upstream of drinking points. In some cities, water carriers were licensed, their buckets marked with seals to ensure they used only approved sources. Fines were issued to those who let animals drink from public fountains, or who fouled the gutters with dye or blood from their trades. Guilds took part too. Bakers needed clean water. So did brewers. Disputes arose, courts settled them, and scribes recorded the judgments. Even then, people knew that what flowed through the town determined its health, its harmony, and its future. Personal hygiene habits. How often did people bathe? In the soft hush of the medieval world, the concept of bathing was very different from what we know today. Bathing was neither daily nor even weekly for most people. The cadence of cleanliness followed the rhythm of seasons, customs, and opportunities. It wasn't uncommon for villagers and even city dwellers to bathe only a few times a year. This may sound quite unpleasant from a modern perspective, but back then, water access was limited, and warm water required firewood, an expensive and time-consuming resource. Baths were taken in large wooden tubs, often filled from buckets warmed over a fire. Sometimes, entire families shared the same bathwater, beginning with the eldest and ending with the youngest. The first in line enjoyed clean water, the last, a murky broth of dirt and soap. Yet this was considered entirely normal. In towns and cities, bathhouses existed and were more common than many imagine. These establishments offered warm, communal baths, sometimes gender-separated, sometimes not. People visited them for hygiene, socializing, and even relaxation. A warm bath, with herbs and oils, soothed the muscles and quieted the mind after a long day's toil. Even monks and nuns had scheduled bath times, often once a month, though some orders allowed more frequent washing. So while it wasn't a daily ritual, bathing did hold a recognized place in medieval life, something to look forward to cleanse both the body and perhaps the soul. Washing hands and faces. Though full-body bathing was rare, washing the hands and face was far more frequent. Most people washed their hands before meals, especially in wealthier households where etiquette demanded cleanliness. This custom wasn't just about removing visible dirt. It was a symbol of politeness, of being presentable before sharing food with others. Basin and yorsets were common in noble and monastic households. Servants would pour water from a jug while the master washed over a bowl. In humbler homes, a simple bowl of cold water served the same purpose. The water might be scented with herbs like rosemary or mint if available. Washing the face was also seen as refreshing and reviving, especially after sleep or labor. It helped wake the senses and start the day with a feeling of readiness. In summer, streams and fountains were often used for a quick splash, while winter made water a less inviting companion. People often believed that too much water exposure could weaken the body or invite illness through the pores. So, moderation was key. Yet, within the limits of knowledge and resources, the medieval person tried to remain clean where they could, at least in the visible places. Hair and beard grooming. Hair was deeply tied to one's identity in the medieval world. Long hair for women, neatly tied or braided, was a sign of modesty and beauty. Men's hair varied with the fashions of the time. Some wore it long and flowing, others short and trimmed, often depending on their profession or region. Grooming was a regular activity. Combs were common, made of wood, bone, or horn. People combed their hair to remove dirt, untangle knots, and get rid of lice, a frequent and persistent nuisance in those days. Beards carried their own cultural weight. Some kings and knights wore them proudly, symbols of wisdom or virility. Monks often shaved their faces entirely, along with their scalps, as part of religious humility. Barbershops existed in towns, offering haircuts, beard trims, and even minor surgeries like bloodletting or tooth pulling. In homes, grooming was a family or individual task. Oils, if affordable, were applied to keep hair healthy and scented. So, while they may not have had shampoos or electric razors, medieval people paid attention to their appearance. Hair, like clothing, was an external statement, a way of showing the world that you cared about order, discipline, and presence. Oral hygiene and tooth powders. Medieval mouths were often filled with pain. Dental care was primitive, and toothaches were a common ailment. Yet that didn't mean people ignored their oral hygiene altogether. Many used cloths or sticks to rub their teeth clean. Tooth powders were also in use, made from herbs, crushed charcoal, ashes, or even ground-up shells. These powders were rubbed onto the teeth using fingers or small brushes made of twigs. Mint, sage, and salt were popular ingredients, not only for their cleansing properties but also for freshening the breath. Chewing herbs like parsley or cloves helped reduce bad smells, especially when dentistry as we know it did not exist. In monasteries, hygiene manuals advised the cleaning of teeth and mouth in the morning. The emphasis was not just on physical cleanliness but also on modesty and health. Bad breath was considered both a social embarrassment and a spiritual distraction. Toothaches, when they came, and they often did, were met with home remedies. Clove oil, honey, or even cauterization were attempted. Extraction was the last resort and was performed by barbers or itinerant tooth pullers, with little training but plenty of nerve. Use of combs, tweezers, and razors. In the quiet corners of daily life, small personal tools played a big role in keeping people neat. Combs, often ornately carved, were both functional and decorative. They removed tangles and lice alike, both of which were ever-present companions in the medieval world. Tweezers were used for plucking stray hairs, sometimes even for removing splinters or cleaning the nails. While these were small tools, they were highly valued and often carried in pouches or cases. Some wealthier individuals had grooming kits with multiple instruments, tucked away with care. Razors, typically made of iron or steel, were used to shave faces and heads. A steady hand was needed, and the work was often entrusted to barbers. In monasteries, shaving the crown, called a tonsure, was a religious requirement. For laymen, shaving was a matter of fashion, age, or occupation. These tools were cleaned and cared for, shared within households or guarded like prized possessions. The act of grooming wasn't just vanity. It was comfort, hygiene, and in many ways, ritual. A few minutes each morning spent before a polished piece of metal, scraping or plucking, was a moment of quiet control in a chaotic world. Cleaning clothing and underwear. In a world without washing machines, keeping clothing clean was a laborious task. Most people owned only a few sets of clothes, and these were worn until visibly soiled. Undergarments, like linen shifts or shirts, were the first to be cleaned, as they absorbed sweat and dirt closest to the skin. Washing involved soaking clothes in cold water, scrubbing them on wooden boards or stones, and using ash, lye, or sometimes soap made from animal fat. Streams, wells, and washhouses were places where women gathered to clean, wring, and hang garments. Clothes were dried in the open air, sun-bleached on lines or bushes. Sometimes, they were beaten with wooden paddles to remove extra water and dirt. In cities, laundresses worked as professionals, taking in the garments of the wealthy. Linen was prized for its cleanliness. It could be boiled and whitened more easily than wool. People often changed linen underclothes more frequently than outerwear. This is where the term clean linen became a synonym for cleanliness itself. Though not always pristine, medieval people valued clean clothing. It was part of dignity, reputation, and sometimes even religious virtue. Foot hygiene and footwear. Feet, the silent travelers of medieval life, endured great hardship. Roads were rough, often muddy or rocky. Shoes, when worn, were made of leather and simple in design. Soft, thin-soled, and easily worn out. For the poor, going barefoot was not uncommon. Keeping feet clean was more about care than luxury. Washing them with warm water, especially at the end of the day, was a simple comfort. In monasteries, the ritual washing of feet was also a spiritual act, done in imitation of Christ. Footwear was practical but often limited in comfort. Cobblers made shoes by hand, and most people owned just 1 or 2 pairs. Socks, if worn, were made of wool and required frequent darning. Cracked heels, blisters, and calluses were common, and herbs like calendula or chamomile might be used to soothe soreness. Foot baths with warm water and salt helped relieve pain after long days of labor. So while the feet bore much of life's burden, they were not forgotten. A warm basin and a soft cloth could offer a moment of relief at day's end. Use of perfumes and scents. In a time before deodorants and colognes, the medieval world relied on nature's perfumes. Scents came from flowers, herbs, and resins. Lavender, rosewater, myrrh, and sandalwood were among the favorites. Perfumed oils were dabbed onto clothes or skin, especially by the wealthy. In cities, apothecaries sold little vials of scented waters, used to mask the smells of sweat or illness. Some perfumes were used during mass or other religious rituals, connecting cleanliness with sanctity. Pomanders, small balls filled with herbs and spices, were worn around the neck or carried in pockets. They served both to perfume the wearer and to ward off bad smells, which people believed could carry disease. Herbs were also strewn on floors, especially in homes or churches, to release fragrance when stepped upon. Scented gloves or sachets in chests added freshness to clothing. While perfume was a luxury for some, the use of scents was widespread, bridging health, beauty, and belief in the invisible powers of the air. Hygiene in travel and pilgrimage. Travel in the medieval world was long, slow, and often dirty. Whether journeying for trade, pilgrimage, or war, people had little opportunity for regular hygiene. Yet they made do with what they had. Streams were used for washing hands and faces. Inns offered basins and cloths, though cleanliness varied. Pilgrims carried small kits, soap, combs, cloths, and sometimes a knife or razor. Bathing was rare, but foot washing was common after a day's walk. Monasteries along pilgrimage routes often offered this act of mercy to weary travelers. Pilgrims wore simple clothes and were recognized by their dusty shoes and badges. Despite the hardships, there was dignity in remaining as clean and orderly as possible. Cleanliness on the road was both a comfort and a sign of devotion. Child and infant hygiene. In the quiet rhythms of medieval homes, caring for children included simple hygiene. Infants were swaddled tightly, sometimes for days, to protect their limbs and keep them warm. Diaper changes were infrequent by today's standards, but cloth was washed and reused. Mothers bathed infants in small wooden tubs, using warm water and herbal infusions. Lavender or chamomile helped calm the skin. Older children were washed more sparingly, often once a week or when dirty from play. Hair was combed, nails trimmed with knives, and faces wiped clean with linen cloths. Children were often more exposed to dirt and illness, and so caring for them was a mix of affection and practicality. In monasteries, orphanages, or noble homes, nurses and wet nurses handled hygiene. The goal was not spotless cleanliness, but comfort, health, and modest care. Cleanliness was seen not just as a bodily need, but as a way to guide children into the rituals of daily life. Menstruation beliefs and taboos. In the quiet corners of medieval Europe, where candlelight flickered gently against stone walls and the rhythm of life moved in tune with the seasons, there existed many beliefs, ancient and inherited, that shaped how people understood the natural cycles of the human body. Among them, menstruation held a particularly mysterious place. Wrapped in layers of folklore, religion, and rudimentary science, it was viewed with a curious blend of reverence, anxiety, and misunderstanding. During the medieval period, menstruation was often considered both a sign of femininity and a mark of impurity. Many people believed that the menstrual cycle was the body's way of purging bad humors, aligning with the popular medical theories of the time, which were heavily influenced by the teachings of Hippocrates and Galen. These ancient physicians theorized that the human body was governed by 4 humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, and balance between them was necessary for health. For women, menstruation was thought to be the natural process by which excess blood was expelled, helping to restore this balance. Yet, this biological event was not merely seen through a medical lens. It carried deep cultural and spiritual weight. In religious texts and teachings, menstruating women were often described as ritually unclean. This belief was particularly pronounced in Christian Europe, where biblical passages from Leviticus, interpreted through medieval theology, shaped attitudes. As a result, menstruating women were sometimes discouraged from participating in religious rituals, entering certain parts of a church, or handling sacred objects. The idea was not necessarily to punish but to protect, at least in the eyes of those who enforced such rules, protect the sacred from the impure, and perhaps protect the woman from the burdens of spiritual defilement. These taboos could lead to social isolation, though not always in obvious or cruel ways. In rural villages and small towns, where close-knit communities shared everything from labor to laughter, a woman might quietly step back from daily religious observances or household tasks during her time of the month. It was not typically announced or enforced with harshness, but rather understood as part of the rhythm of life, something whispered among women, acknowledged with knowing looks, and gently accommodated. However, the perception of menstruation was not universally negative. In some circles, it was viewed as a sign of fertility and health. Midwives, who held a revered and essential role in medieval communities, often interpreted the regularity of a woman's cycle as an indication of her reproductive strength. A missed period might prompt immediate prayers or herbal remedies, not to suppress the cycle, but to encourage its return, lest it signal illness or infertility. In other regions, menstruation held an oddly protective mystique. There were whispers that menstrual blood could ward off pests or spoil crops, not because of its inherent power, but because of the fear and superstition it inspired. In some old folk traditions, it was believed that if a menstruating woman walked through a field, the harvest would fail. While this may seem harsh or absurd by modern standards, it reveals how deeply rooted and emotionally charged these beliefs were. Women, of course, carried on. They navigated these beliefs with quiet dignity, sharing wisdom mother to daughter, friend to friend. While society imposed taboos, women built networks of understanding. They supported each other through pain and discomfort, offering herbs to ease cramps, sharing cloth pads sewn from worn linens, or just providing companionship in those solitary days. Despite the limitations of the time, these women were not helpless or passive. They developed systems of care based on observation, experimentation, and tradition. In monasteries, convents, and humble cottages, women's knowledge grew. Midwives recorded patterns, healed ailments, and passed on knowledge orally. While male physicians wrote Latin texts that often misunderstood or ignored menstruation, women quietly kept the real knowledge alive. So as we settle into this gentle moment of reflection, imagine the rhythm of life in those old stone villages, the way women wove their experiences into the fabric of daily existence. Their lives were shaped by beliefs that at once confined and protected, shrouded in secrecy yet grounded in practical care. In the end, menstruation in medieval times was not just a biological process. It was a deeply social experience, one that connected women across generations and geographies in quiet, enduring sisterhood. Homemade menstrual products. In the absence of modern conveniences, medieval women displayed remarkable ingenuity and resourcefulness when it came to managing their menstrual flow. With no disposable pads, tampons, or synthetic materials, they turned to the world around them. Fabric, wool, moss, and even plant fibers, to create practical, if imperfect, solutions. Linen was the most common material used for menstrual cloths. Soft, absorbent, and widely available, old pieces of linen would be cut and folded into thick pads. These were sometimes layered or stitched for additional absorption, and then placed in undergarments or held in place with belts or ties. These homemade pads had to be washed and dried after every use, a laborious but necessary task, often done discreetly to avoid shame or questions. In poorer households, where even old linen was precious, women might use moss, grass, or natural sponges, materials that were absorbent but far from comfortable. Soft wool, known for its warmth and ability to wick moisture, was another alternative. In coastal regions, sea sponges were harvested, cleaned, and used internally, held in place by cloth or natural wrapping. Some women used rudimentary undergarments fashioned with drawstrings or ties to keep the materials in place. Underwear in the modern sense wasn't commonly worn by most medieval women, especially in the earlier part of the period. But during menstruation, special drawers or linen wraps were sometimes used to help secure the pad and provide a degree of privacy. Medieval manuscripts rarely mention these homemade products directly, as menstruation remained a private topic. But fragments of cloth found in archaeological digs, combined with references in medical and religious texts, offer clues about these practices. Laundry accounts from nunneries and aristocratic households also hint at the washing and reuse of menstrual cloths. Despite the simplicity of these products, women found ways to make them comfortable. Herbs like lavender or rosemary were sometimes sewn into the cloths to mask odor or ease cramps. Midwives and wise women would offer suggestions for reducing discomfort, special teas, baths, or oils that helped the body cope with the physical strain. The lack of sanitary infrastructure meant hygiene was always a concern. Cloths were often boiled or sun-dried to clean them, and women were careful about keeping their bodies and garments clean despite limited access to water or bathing facilities. In communities where open discussion was taboo, this knowledge passed quietly between mothers and daughters, a silent yet vital inheritance. In monasteries, where cleanliness and routine were emphasized, nuns developed highly organized systems for washing and storing menstrual cloths. These women, though bound by religious rules, were meticulous in maintaining hygiene, sometimes more so than their secular counterparts. What's striking is how adaptable these women were. With few resources and little external support, they developed methods to preserve dignity and health. Their homemade menstrual products, humble as they were, represented both survival and self-care in a world that offered little in the way of comfort or understanding. Bathing during menstruation. The topic of bathing during menstruation was surrounded by a mix of fear, custom, and cautious practice in the medieval world. While bathing was not a daily activity for most people, it still held spiritual, medicinal, and social significance. However, for menstruating women, the idea of immersing oneself in water was met with varying opinions depending on the region, religion, and personal beliefs. In many Christian communities, menstruating women were considered ritually impure. This belief sometimes extended to water sources, especially if they were shared. A woman might avoid communal bathhouses during her cycle, not necessarily out of law, but from a mix of modesty, peer pressure, and ingrained religious belief. Despite this, bathing was not entirely forbidden. In fact, women often turned to warm baths for relief during menstruation. Herbal baths, made with chamomile, yarrow, or mugwort, were common remedies for easing cramps and fatigue. These soothing baths were usually taken in wooden tubs within the privacy of a home or a designated space in a monastery or manor. The idea that cold water could shock the womb or disrupt the humors of the body was widespread. Warm water was preferred, believed to encourage proper flow and relaxation. Medical texts of the time advised against cold plunges, warning that they could halt menstruation and cause internal imbalances. In wealthier households and religious institutions, where bathing infrastructure was more developed, menstruating women were given designated times or areas to bathe. Nuns, for example, followed strict rules about when and how to bathe, with specific procedures outlined in convent regulations. If a nun was menstruating, she might be allowed additional bathing time for cleanliness, though she was still expected to adhere to rules of modesty. Midwives and healers often recommended steam baths during menstruation. Women would sit over heated herbs, allowing the steam to ease discomfort and maintain cleanliness. These steam treatments were particularly popular in colder regions where full immersion was less feasible. For many medieval women, the act of bathing during menstruation wasn't just about hygiene. It was an act of quiet resilience. In a time when their natural cycle was misunderstood and sometimes stigmatized, bathing offered relief, solace, and a sense of control over their bodies. Pregnancy and cleanliness rituals. Pregnancy in the medieval period was both a sacred and vulnerable time. Without modern medical knowledge or prenatal care, women relied on tradition, spiritual rituals, and the support of other women to maintain health and cleanliness throughout pregnancy. Hygiene practices were often interwoven with religious observances and folk customs, intended to protect both mother and child. Expectant mothers were encouraged to maintain cleanliness as a way of ensuring the baby's well-being. Washing the body with warm water, scented herbs, and mild soap was common among those who could afford such luxuries. These cleansing rituals were sometimes accompanied by prayers or blessings, especially during significant points in the pregnancy, such as the quickening, when the mother first felt the baby move. Women were advised to avoid communal baths in the later stages of pregnancy, as the risk of illness or contamination was feared. Private baths were preferred, with the assistance of midwives or trusted female companions. Bathing was believed to soften the skin and prepare the body for childbirth, while also serving as a spiritual purification before labor. Midwives often encouraged gentle hygiene routines, cleaning the breasts, washing the genital area, and keeping fingernails trimmed, to reduce the risk of infection during and after childbirth. These recommendations were rooted in experience rather than science, passed down from generations of women who observed patterns and outcomes. In religious communities, pregnancy was often wrapped in symbolism. Mary, the mother of Jesus, served as a model for cleanliness and humility. Some women wore amulets or relics to protect the unborn child, while others followed specific prayers during washing, invoking saints or angels for protection. For many women, especially those in monasteries or under the care of nuns, cleanliness during pregnancy became a spiritual discipline. It was not only about physical preparation but about maintaining a pure heart and soul in anticipation of new life. Postpartum hygiene practices. After childbirth, medieval women entered a period of recovery that required both physical healing and spiritual reintegration. Known as the lying-in period, this time was marked by rest, care from other women, and attention to hygiene, though resources and practices varied widely depending on class and region. The first days after childbirth were critical. Women were encouraged to remain in bed, and their bodies were washed with warm water infused with soothing herbs such as lavender, calendula, and comfrey. These washes helped clean wounds, reduce inflammation, and prevent infection. Though without antiseptics or antibiotics, complications were common. Cloth pads were used to absorb postpartum bleeding, much like menstrual cloths, but often larger and more frequently changed. These cloths had to be cleaned carefully, and midwives oversaw this task in many homes, ensuring the mother remained dry and comfortable. In wealthier households and monasteries, postpartum women were sometimes given a full-body bath within a few days of delivery. This was seen as both hygienic and restorative, often accompanied by prayers or religious rites. In contrast, poorer women might rely on sponge baths or simple cloth washes, with help from female relatives. Ritual purification also played a role. In Christian tradition, women were often expected to undergo a churching ceremony before returning to public religious life. This rite, which took place weeks after childbirth, involved prayers of thanksgiving and blessing, marking the woman's return to spiritual purity. Prior to this ceremony, many women took special baths, dressed in clean garments, and prepared themselves with reverence. Even though postpartum hygiene lacked modern understanding, medieval women developed routines that emphasized care, cleanliness, and respect for the profound journey of motherhood. These practices, while humble, reveal a deep awareness of the body's needs during one of life's most transformative experiences. Washing and dressing wounds. In the medieval period, women were often skilled in the art of washing and dressing wounds, a vital part of feminine hygiene and care. Whether from childbirth, accidents, or everyday chores, wounds required immediate and careful attention to prevent infection, which was poorly understood but keenly feared. Washing wounds was typically done with clean water, often infused with healing herbs such as sage, rosemary, or thyme. These plants were believed to possess antiseptic and soothing qualities. The water was boiled when possible, a practice aimed at killing impurities, and then cooled before use. Women used cloths or soft linen to gently clean wounds, removing dirt and blood without aggravating the injury. Applying herbal poultices, made from crushed leaves, roots, or flowers, was common. Ingredients like comfrey, known as knitbone, helped speed healing and reduce inflammation. Dressing wounds required clean bandages, often made from linen, cotton, or wool. These were changed regularly to keep the injury dry and protected from infection. Midwives, healers, and mothers learned these techniques through experience and oral tradition, and their knowledge was passed down through generations. Sometimes, magical or religious elements were added, prayers, holy water, or charms, to invoke divine protection or healing power. Though not scientifically effective, these rituals provided comfort and hope. Maintaining hygiene during wound care was critical, especially in the absence of antibiotics. Women's attentiveness to cleanliness in these matters helped reduce mortality and speed recovery in an age of limited medical resources. Midwives and their tools. Midwives played an indispensable role in medieval feminine hygiene, childbirth, and women's health. They were often the primary healthcare providers for women, combining practical knowledge, herbal remedies, and spiritual guidance. A midwife's toolkit was simple but effective. It typically included clean linen cloths, herbal preparations, sharp scissors or knives for cutting cords or dressings, and sometimes rudimentary instruments like forceps, though their use was rare and often controversial. Midwives carried containers for water and herbal infusions, used for washing the mother and newborn. They also had items for hygiene, such as soap, made from animal fat and ash, towels, and poultices for wound care. Their expertise extended beyond delivery. Midwives advised on personal hygiene, menstrual health, postpartum care, and even contraception or fertility when knowledge permitted. They were trusted confidants, often called upon to assist with other women's ailments, and their role was both medical and social. Training was informal, passed down from experienced midwives to apprentices. Some nuns acted as midwives within convents, bringing a religious dimension to their care. Midwives' reputation was critical. Those considered skilled and trustworthy were valued deeply by their communities. Despite occasional suspicion or accusations of witchcraft, midwives were essential for maintaining feminine hygiene and health, bridging the gap between medicine and everyday life. Cleanliness in female monasteries. Female monasteries were centers of discipline, spirituality, and relative hygiene during the medieval era. Nuns followed strict rules regarding cleanliness, recognizing its importance for physical health and spiritual purity. Daily routines included regular washing of hands, face, and sometimes full-body bathing, though the frequency varied by order and climate. Linen habits were kept clean and regularly laundered, reflecting both modesty and hygiene. Monasteries often had better access to water than ordinary households, with wells, cisterns, and occasionally rudimentary plumbing. This allowed for more consistent hygiene practices, including washing of clothes and linens. Toilets in monasteries were modest but maintained with care. Many convents had garderobes with wooden seats and chutes leading outside, designed to minimize odors and contamination. Nuns were expected to maintain personal hygiene as part of their devotion. Washing before prayers, attending to cleanliness after meals, and caring for minor wounds were integral parts of monastic discipline. Female monasteries also served as places of healing and education. Nuns acted as midwives, herbalists, and caregivers to the local population, imparting knowledge about feminine hygiene and health that was otherwise scarce. The emphasis on cleanliness in these communities contrasted with popular misconceptions about medieval filth, showing that hygiene was valued and practiced where conditions allowed. Herbal remedies for odor. Managing bodily odors was an important concern for medieval women, especially given the limited hygiene facilities and the stigma attached to natural scents. Herbal remedies provided a practical and fragrant solution. Common herbs included lavender, rosemary, sage, and mint, plants known for their pleasant aromas and mild antiseptic properties. These were often dried and sewn into small sachets or pouches, carried in clothing or placed near bedding. Women made herbal waters or distillations, using flowers and leaves steeped in hot water, to wash intimate areas or add scent to bathing water. Such washes helped reduce unpleasant odors and were believed to promote cleanliness and health. Some recipes combined herbs with vinegar or wine, which acted as natural preservatives and cleansers. These mixtures were sometimes applied with cloths or used as rinses. Perfumed powders made from crushed herbs mixed with powdered chalk or starch were sprinkled on the body or clothing to absorb moisture and scent. Herbs were also integrated into menstrual cloths or undergarments, providing discreet odor control during menstruation. The use of herbal remedies reflected both practical hygiene and the medieval love for fragrant gardens. These natural scents offered comfort and social acceptance in a world where artificial deodorants did not exist. Social attitudes towards female hygiene. Social attitudes towards female hygiene in the medieval period were complex, shaped by religious doctrine, cultural norms, and limited medical knowledge. Women's bodies were often viewed through a lens of moral and spiritual significance, which influenced how hygiene practices were perceived and discussed. Menstruation was widely regarded as impure or shameful, leading to secrecy and taboo around feminine hygiene. Women were expected to manage their cycles quietly and discreetly, avoiding public discussion or display. Bathing practices were influenced by notions of modesty and virtue. Public baths were sometimes off-limits to women or segregated by gender to prevent scandal. A woman's cleanliness was linked to her social reputation, with uncleanliness sometimes viewed as a sign of moral failing. Despite these constraints, women actively sought ways to care for their bodies and maintain health. The use of herbal remedies, bathing rituals, and cleanliness during menstruation and childbirth showed a practical understanding that transcended stigma. Religious teachings often emphasized purity, encouraging regular washing of hands and face, especially before prayer or meals. However, some doctrines warned against excessive bathing, fearing it might provoke temptation or weaken spiritual resolve. Women's hygiene was also a class issue. Wealthier women had better access to baths, clean clothing, and privacy, while poorer women faced greater challenges but adapted with resourcefulness. Overall, while social attitudes imposed limits and taboos, medieval women navigated these with resilience, care, and knowledge, preserving their dignity and health in an often harsh world. The Black Death and Hygiene Panic. The Black Death, which ravaged Europe between 1347 and 1351, remains one of the deadliest pandemics in human history, killing an estimated one-third to half of Europe's population. The sudden and devastating impact of the plague led to widespread panic, fear, and confusion about how the disease spread, and it dramatically influenced medieval perceptions of hygiene and sanitation. People believed the plague was caused by bad air, or miasma, and that foul smells could infect the living. As a result, a hygiene panic swept through towns and cities, with citizens desperately trying to clean their environments to avoid the deadly contagion. Streets were scrubbed, waste was removed more rigorously, and households burned herbs and aromatic substances to purify the air. Despite limited understanding of germs or bacteria, these responses marked an early attempt at public health measures and highlighted the importance of sanitation. The Black Death revealed just how crucial cleanliness was in preventing disease, even if medieval science didn't fully grasp why. Miasma theory and smell. The dominant medical theory during the medieval period was the miasma theory, the belief that diseases like the plague were spread through noxious or poisonous air, filled with foul odors. This theory shaped public health practices and sanitation efforts for centuries. According to miasma theory, bad smells, emanating from rotting waste, stagnant water, and decaying bodies, were the root cause of illness. The smell was considered not just unpleasant but deadly, contaminating the air breathed by the population. Consequently, authorities and individuals sought to control odors by cleaning streets, removing garbage, and burning aromatic herbs and incense. Towns employed searchers to locate and remove sources of foul smell, and regulations were enacted to prevent open defecation and waste disposal in public areas. While modern science has disproven miasma theory, it nonetheless encouraged behaviors that helped improve sanitation and reduce disease spread, serving as a primitive form of public health intervention. Burning aromatics to clean the air. Burning aromatic substances was a widespread practice intended to purify the air and ward off disease, especially during plague outbreaks. People believed that fragrant smoke could neutralize the miasma and protect them from infection. Common aromatics included herbs like rosemary, lavender, thyme, and sage, as well as resins such as frankincense and myrrh. These were burned in braziers or carried in small bags known as poses or tussamusses. In homes, streets, and public spaces, fires or braziers filled with these substances created thick smoke intended to cleanse the air. Doctors, recognizable by their beaked masks filled with aromatic herbs, used this practice to protect themselves while treating plague victims. This custom had some unintended benefits. The smoke helped repel flies and other insects that could carry disease, though the actual germ theory connection was unknown. Burning aromatics was both a medical and spiritual act, symbolizing the fight against death and decay in an era of terror and uncertainty. Quarantine and isolation practices. Quarantine and isolation emerged as critical responses to controlling the spread of the plague and other contagious diseases. The term quarantine itself comes from the Italian 40 giorni, meaning 40 days, referring to the isolation period imposed on ships and travelers suspected of carrying the disease. Ports and cities established quarantine stations, where incoming ships, goods, and people were held before being allowed entry. Entire households or neighborhoods were sometimes sealed off if infection was suspected. Isolation extended to the sick, who were removed from healthy populations and confined in pest houses, lazarettos, or even their homes. Families were often separated, and the sick cared for by specially appointed attendants. Though quarantine was a harsh and sometimes ineffective measure, it laid the foundation for modern public health policies and demonstrated an early understanding of disease containment. Disposing of the dead. The enormous death toll caused by plagues overwhelmed medieval burial practices and challenged sanitation in towns and cities. Proper disposal of the dead became urgent to prevent further disease spread and the foul odors associated with decomposition. Mass graves, called plague pits, were dug quickly to accommodate the vast numbers of bodies. These pits were often located outside city walls or near churches, but sometimes they were hastily created within town limits. Churches and clergy played a role in organizing burials, but overwhelmed by the scale of death, many bodies were buried without the usual rites or individual markers. The disposal of bodies also involved cleaning and washing the dead, when possible, but sanitary standards were rudimentary. Sometimes the dead were burned or buried with layers of lime to reduce odor and accelerate decomposition. The spectacle of piled corpses and rapid burials intensified fears and reinforced the association between death, disease, and filth. Street cleaners and gong farmers. In medieval towns, street cleanliness was crucial but challenging. Street cleaners and gong farmers were responsible for removing human waste and garbage from urban areas. Gong farmers earned their name from the gong, a slang term for cesspits or privies. They worked mostly at night, emptying cesspits and transporting waste outside city walls for disposal or reuse as fertilizer. Their work was essential for maintaining public health but socially stigmatized. Gong farmers were often marginalized, seen as dirty and low status despite the critical nature of their job. Street cleaners swept roads and removed refuse, attempting to keep the bustling streets free from accumulations of filth that attracted pests and spread odor. These laborious contributed to the slow evolution of urban sanitation systems, performing a dirty but necessary role in the medieval hygiene infrastructure. Pest houses and leper colonies. Pest houses and leper colonies were specialized institutions established to isolate individuals afflicted with contagious diseases, particularly plague and leprosy. Pest houses were often located on the outskirts of towns, designed to house plague victims away from the healthy population. Care was rudimentary, focusing on isolation rather than treatment. Leper colonies, or lazar houses, served a similar purpose for those suffering from leprosy, a chronic and stigmatized disease. Lepers were forced to live separately, often under harsh conditions, and were subject to social ostracism. Both types of facilities reflected medieval attempts to control contagion through segregation and quarantine. The social and psychological effects were profound, as sufferers faced isolation and discrimination alongside their illnesses. These institutions are early examples of public health efforts to manage epidemics through containment and specialized care. Role of the Church in public health. The Church wielded enormous influence over medieval society, including public health and sanitation practices. Clergy often provided care for the sick, operated hospitals, and managed burial rites. Religious institutions were among the few organizations with resources and organization to respond to plagues and hygiene crises. Monasteries and convents cared for the ill, administered herbal remedies, and offered spiritual comfort. The Church preached moral explanations for disease, often interpreting outbreaks as divine punishment for sin. This belief motivated charitable acts, such as caring for the poor and sick, but also fueled stigma and persecution. Church authorities regulated behaviors related to cleanliness, sometimes promoting bathing and hygiene, but at other times discouraging excessive indulgence seen as temptation. Overall, the church was central to medieval approaches to health, hygiene, and disease, blending spiritual care with practical intervention. Disease and moral blame. Disease in the medieval period was often interpreted through a moral and religious framework, leading to blame placed on individuals or groups deemed sinful or corrupt. Outbreaks were attributed to divine wrath for societal sins, including heresy, immorality, or neglect of religious duties. This belief justified punishment, persecution, and scapegoating. Jews, lepers, and other marginalized groups were frequently accused of causing plagues through poisoning wells or sinful behavior, leading to violence and expulsion. Moral blame extended to personal hygiene, with uncleanliness seen not only as a health risk but as a sign of spiritual failing. This moralistic view complicated public health responses by mixing superstition and fear with practical concerns, sometimes hindering effective disease control. Holy relics and sanitary concerns. Holy relics, such as bones, clothing, or objects associated with saints, were revered and displayed in churches and shrines. Their veneration sometimes posed sanitary challenges, as crowds gathered for public viewings, increasing the risk of disease transmission. Custodians of relics took care to preserve their cleanliness and prevent contamination, often housing them in elaborate reliquaries. Pilgrims visiting relics washed their hands or faces with water touched to the relic, believing in its healing power. Church authorities occasionally issued guidelines to maintain hygiene during large religious gatherings, blending reverence with practical health considerations. Moral metaphors in bathing. Bathing and cleanliness were rich sources of moral and spiritual metaphors in medieval religious thought. Washing symbolized the cleansing of sin, the renewal of the soul, and preparation for a holy life. Sermons and religious texts often used the metaphor of bathing to encourage repentance and moral purification. The imagery of water washing away impurities reinforced the concept of baptism as spiritual rebirth. This moral framing elevated physical hygiene to a sacred duty, intertwining bodily care with religious responsibility. Religious holidays and cleanliness. Religious festivals and holidays were often occasions for increased attention to personal and communal cleanliness. Feasts such as Easter and Christmas included rituals of purification, with participants washing themselves and their homes. Some holidays were associated with specific cleansing rites or the use of holy water for blessing. Communities sometimes organized collective cleaning efforts in churches and public spaces to prepare for celebrations. These practices underscored the importance of entering holy times in a state of purity, both physically and spiritually. Influence of religion on public hygiene laws. Religion heavily influenced medieval laws and regulations related to hygiene and sanitation. Church authorities often collaborated with civic leaders to enforce cleanliness standards, such as waste disposal rules and street cleaning. Moral teachings about purity translated into practical mandates to keep living areas clean and prevent disease. Some cities enacted ordinances requiring the removal of garbage and the maintenance of public baths, inspired by religious ideals of cleanliness. The intertwining of religious doctrine and public health created a framework where hygiene was both a civic duty and a spiritual obligation. Castle plumbing innovations. Medieval castles, often seen as symbols of power and prestige, also featured remarkable innovations in plumbing and sanitation for their time. Unlike common townsfolk who relied on basic privies or chamber pots, castle designers implemented early forms of indoor plumbing to improve hygiene and comfort. One of the most notable advancements was the introduction of garderobes, small chambers built into castle walls with chutes that allowed waste to drop down into the moat or cesspits below. In some cases, rudimentary drainage systems channeled water from rain or nearby wells to flush waste away. Certain castles even featured latrine towers, separate structures built to house toilets for the lord and his household. The water from nearby streams or rainwater was sometimes used to carry away waste, showcasing early awareness of sanitation engineering. These innovations were not universal but demonstrated a significant step toward improving hygiene within the often cramped and busy environments of medieval manors. Hidden privies in walls. Many castles and manors cleverly concealed their toilets within thick stone walls, providing privacy and discreet waste management. These hidden privies were often small chambers accessed through narrow corridors or spiral staircases. The walls themselves were hollowed out to accommodate these spaces, allowing waste to drop directly outside the castle or into moats. This design helped keep unpleasant odors and sights away from the main living quarters. In addition to privacy, hidden privies minimized the risk of waste contamination inside the castle, improving overall sanitation for inhabitants. Such architectural ingenuity reflected the need to blend comfort, hygiene, and defense, as exposing vulnerable parts of the castle to the outside world was avoided. Waste disposal techniques. Disposing of human waste in the medieval period posed significant challenges, especially in castles and manors where maintaining hygiene was critical to health and comfort. Besides garderobes and privies, waste was often collected in cesspits located underground, requiring periodic cleaning. This task, unpleasant but necessary, was usually assigned to servants or designated workers known as gong farmers. Some castles employed early flushing systems where water from rain or wells was used to wash away waste through drainage channels. Moats and nearby streams occasionally served as natural waste disposal sites, though this caused contamination risks. Waste disposal was carefully managed to prevent the buildup of odors and reduce the spread of disease, though understanding of microbes was limited. Luxury bathing rooms. While most medieval people bathed infrequently, the wealthy occupants of castles and manors sometimes enjoyed luxurious bathing rooms that offered comfort and refinement. These rooms were often richly decorated, featuring large wooden or stone tubs, heated water, and fragrant oils or herbs for bathing. Some castles had dedicated bathing chambers with fireplaces or braziers to warm the water, reflecting the importance of bathing as a symbol of status and cleanliness. Luxury baths were not only for hygiene but also for relaxation and social interaction among the elite, showing how bathing culture evolved in aristocratic settings. Servants and sanitation duties. Maintaining hygiene in castles and manors was a labor-intensive task that relied heavily on servants who performed sanitation duties daily. These servants were responsible for cleaning privies, emptying chamber pots, managing waste disposal, and washing linens and garments. They also tended to the bathing chambers, preparing hot water, and ensuring the availability of herbs and perfumes to mask odors. Despite their critical role, sanitation work was often considered menial and unpleasant, with servants sometimes stigmatized despite their essential contributions to health and comfort. Cleaning textiles and linens. Hygiene in castles extended beyond the person to the cleanliness of textiles and linens, which were crucial for comfort and health. Linens, bedding, and clothing were washed regularly by servants, often using natural soaps made from animal fats and ashes, and rinsed in cold or warm water. Sun drying and airing were common methods to keep fabrics fresh and reduce odors. Some noble households used fragrant herbs like lavender or rosemary tucked into bedding to maintain freshness and mask less pleasant smells. Proper care of textiles helped prevent infestations of lice and other pests, which were common in medieval living environments. Use of fragrant herbs in chambers. To combat unpleasant smells inherent in castles and manors, fragrant herbs were widely used throughout living quarters. Herbs such as rosemary, lavender, mint, and thyme were hung in bundles or scattered on floors and beds to provide pleasant aromas and some believed antiseptic properties. These herbs were sometimes placed in chamber pots or privies to reduce odors, making daily life more bearable. The use of herbs also had symbolic importance, as pleasant scents were associated with purity and refinement. Toilets in hunting lodges. Hunting lodges, often located in remote areas, presented unique challenges for sanitation and hygiene. These lodges, used seasonally, had simpler toilet facilities compared to castles or manors, often consisting of basic privies or designated outdoor areas. Servants managed waste disposal, sometimes digging pits or directing waste into nearby streams. Despite their rustic nature, maintaining cleanliness was important to avoid health issues during extended stays. Hunting lodges reflected the practical adaptations of hygiene practices to different medieval living contexts. Royal versus noble hygiene habits. Hygiene habits varied between royalty and the nobility, influenced by access to resources, cultural practices, and social expectations. Royal households typically had greater access to bathing facilities, fresh water, and luxury items like scented oils and fine textiles. Kings and queens often employed personal attendants to assist with bathing, grooming, and sanitation, emphasizing their status and refinement. Nobles, while privileged, had more modest means and often shared bathing and toilet facilities among larger households. These differences affected perceptions of cleanliness and comfort within the medieval elite. Seasonal adjustments in sanitary practice. Seasonal changes influenced hygiene practices in castles and manors, as weather and resource availability affected water supply and waste management. In winter, cold temperatures limited bathing frequency and water heating posed challenges. Waste disposal was more difficult in frozen or rainy conditions, requiring adapted methods to prevent health hazards. Spring and summer allowed more frequent washing and airing of linens, along with increased outdoor waste removal. These seasonal adjustments showcased the flexibility and resilience of medieval sanitation systems. Renaissance views on cleanliness. The Renaissance period, spanning roughly from the 14th to the 17th century, marked a significant shift in attitudes toward cleanliness and personal hygiene. Inspired by the revival of classical knowledge and humanism, people began to reconsider the importance of bodily cleanliness, not only for health but also as a reflection of social status and morality. Unlike the medieval period, where bathing was often limited and sometimes viewed with suspicion, Renaissance thinkers and physicians advocated more regular washing as essential for well-being. Public and private baths were restored and improved in many cities, and hygiene became a subject of scholarly debate. This renewed focus on cleanliness was tied to broader cultural movements emphasizing the value of the individual body and its care, setting the stage for later advancements in sanitation and public health. Influence of science on sanitation. The rise of science during and after the Renaissance brought a new understanding of disease and sanitation. While medieval beliefs were often rooted in superstition and humoral theory, scientific inquiry began to reveal links between cleanliness and health. Pioneers like Andreas Vesalius advanced anatomy, while later scientists such as Robert Hooke and Antony van Leeuwenhoek discovered microorganisms, laying the groundwork for germ theory centuries later. These discoveries gradually challenged the prevailing miasma theory that bad smells caused illness, instead suggesting that invisible agents could spread disease. Scientific progress influenced sanitation practices by encouraging better waste disposal, water cleanliness, and personal hygiene, leading toward the modern public health framework. The printing press and health manuals. The invention of the printing press in the mid-15th century revolutionized the dissemination of knowledge, including information about hygiene and health. Health manuals and pamphlets, previously accessible only to the elite, became widely available to the literate public. These printed guides offered advice on bathing, cleanliness, diet, and sanitation, empowering more people to adopt healthier habits. They also spread new scientific ideas and public health recommendations, helping to standardize hygiene practices across Europe. The printing press thus played a crucial role in bridging the gap between medieval and modern hygiene by educating society. Rediscovery of Roman hygiene practices. Renaissance scholars deeply admired ancient Roman civilization, particularly its sophisticated hygiene infrastructure. Roman baths, aqueducts, and sewer systems were studied and sometimes replicated as models of public sanitation. The knowledge of these ancient practices inspired urban planners and architects to improve water supply and waste management in growing cities. Rediscovering Roman techniques highlighted the importance of public baths, clean water, and sewage systems, which had declined during the Middle Ages. This revival marked a return to more advanced sanitation concepts, influencing the development of modern hygiene. Soap production and popularization. Soap, while known in antiquity, became increasingly popular and widely produced during the late medieval and Renaissance periods. Initially a luxury item made from animal fats and ashes, soap manufacturing improved with the introduction of vegetable oils and chemical additives. Centers of soap production, such as Marseille in France and Castile in Spain, gained fame for their quality soaps. The growing availability and affordability of soap encouraged more frequent personal washing. Soap was promoted not just for cleanliness but also for health, helping to combat skin diseases and reducing infection. Changes in urban infrastructure. As European cities expanded, urban infrastructure underwent significant changes to improve sanitation and public health. Medieval narrow streets and open sores gave way to wider roads and covered drainage systems. Efforts were made to supply clean drinking water through fountains and aqueducts, while waste removal became more organized with dedicated workers. Regulations regarding the disposal of waste and maintenance of public baths and toilets emerged. These improvements reflected a growing awareness of the link between environment, hygiene, and disease prevention in urban settings. Enlightenment-era cleanliness ideals. The Enlightenment further elevated the ideals of cleanliness as part of broader rationalist and humanitarian values. Thinkers emphasized reason, science, and progress, advocating for societal reforms including public health measures. Cleanliness was associated with discipline, civility, and moral virtue, encouraging individuals to maintain personal hygiene as a social responsibility. Educational campaigns and health policies promoted bathing, washing hands, and maintaining clean homes. The period laid intellectual foundations for modern hygiene standards and public health institutions. The role of fashion in hygiene. Fashion during the Renaissance and Enlightenment influenced hygiene practices in subtle but important ways. Elaborate clothing styles, heavy fabrics, and wigs required more frequent washing and care to prevent lice and odors. Perfumes and scented powders became fashionable to mask body odors, reflecting both practical and aesthetic concerns. The desire to present a clean, attractive appearance motivated the use of soaps, baths, and grooming rituals. Fashion thus acted as a social driver, encouraging the adoption of better hygiene habits among the elite and eventually the broader population. Public health reforms in the late medieval period. Toward the end of the medieval era, public health reforms began to address the dire sanitation problems in growing towns and cities. Authorities enacted laws regulating waste disposal, street cleaning, and the construction of latrines and wells. Quarantine measures and the establishment of pest houses helped control outbreaks of plague and other infectious diseases. Municipal governance increasingly took responsibility for sanitation infrastructure and hygiene enforcement. These reforms marked early efforts to manage hygiene on a community-wide scale, moving beyond individual or household practices. From medieval toilets to modern bathrooms. The gradual evolution from medieval toilets and hygiene practices culminated in the emergence of modern bathrooms. Advances in plumbing technology, including flush toilets and sewer systems, transformed sanitation in the 18th and 19th centuries. Private bathrooms equipped with running water, bathtubs, and sinks became symbols of comfort and health. The decline of chamber pots, cesspits, and open sores marked a dramatic improvement in hygiene standards. This transition was driven by scientific knowledge, urban reforms, and changing social attitudes, linking medieval sanitation innovations to the modern bathroom we recognize today.